Thank you very much. And thank you for having accepted to host this series on Vatican II. I hadn't planned to say why, but since you kind of gave an opening for that, the reason why is because the patron of this parish is Blessed John the 23rd. And what better place to have a series on the Second Vatican Council, but in this environment which is under the protection and the patronage of this good Pope. And so I'm very pleased to be here tonight and to open this reflection. And it's also a kind of reconsideration of what Vatican II is all about. When I was preparing for the presentation this evening, there was a story that I wanted to start off with. There was a group of Catholic students in a high school not so long ago. The teacher asked the question, "What is Vatican II?" And after much hesitation, one of the students finally raised his hands and he said, "Would that be the Pope's summer residence?" Obviously, that high school student and his fellow students didn't know anything about Vatican II. Last Friday night, at our launch for the Steubenville conference, I had a similar situation when I was speaking and I prefaced a personal remark by saying, just a few years ago, in 1976, and everybody started to laugh. And it kind of dawned on me that for the people that were gathered on Friday night, 1976 was not just a few years ago. And when I asked how many were born in 1976 in the audience, there's only one person that raised his hand. All of this is simply to say that for many, the reference to Vatican II is not necessarily something that's obvious or self-evident. And I thought maybe there are those in our church right now who would appreciate reconnecting with what took place 50 years ago. Because it's 50 years ago that Vatican II began. And so here we are this evening looking at this event and looking at what has transpired, at least one perspective, my own, on the church in these past 50 years. So this series has been organized by the parish not only as a parish event, but there are hopefully others who are listening in through our modern means of communication, which 50 years ago we wouldn't have been able to do. But there are people who are listening in and who are going to follow this evening's talk, at least, from where they are in front of their computer. We're here to take a look at Vatican II, what it intended to do, and why it is so central to the year of faith and the new evangelization that we've embarked upon as a diocese. So I want to thank the pastor and the people of this parish who have taken on the challenge of organizing this series. When Pope Benedict launched the Year of Faith on October the 11th, 2011, he announced the Year of Faith. And in announcing this Year of Faith, he himself quoted John Paul II. And the quote from John Paul II is that Vatican II was the great grace bestowed on the Church on the 20th century. Well, if the Year of Faith is to be understood as Pope Benedict described it, as the door of faith, then this door needs to be opened. And during this special time of grace, our archdiocese, I'm hoping and praying, will get to appreciate what our Catholic faith is all about. And so we have to walk through this door. And as we walk through it, and the journey that it allows us to enter into, hopefully it will bring us to a better experience and a better understanding of what is central to our faith. And what is central to our faith is that it needs to be a heartfelt, conscious response to our personal encounter of Jesus Christ. And so becoming familiar with the substance of Vatican II's teaching, I think, is an essential thing to do as we journey towards our encounter, or maybe our re-encounter of Christ. And that event, which was the council, is the primary reason why the Year of Faith and the Synod on the new evangelization was inaugurated on the 50th anniversary of the opening of the Second Vatican Council, which was October 11th, 1962. Now, what about this Pope John the 23rd? Just a few little things. He was elected Pope in 1958, on October the 20th. He was 76 years old. And they elected him because they thought, he's an old guy, he's only going to be around for a little while, and we'll be able to kind of show him what to do and, kind of lead him along until he goes to God. They all thought he was going to be a transitional pope. No one had ever expected that he would do the things that he ended up doing, because he, in fact, turned out to be the one who really changed the course for our church in the last 50 years. Do any of you know what his personal name is? That was his family name, and his baptismal name was Angelo Giuseppe. So he was an angel, and he was a Joseph, and he was a Roncalli as a family name. He was a man who was a very simple man. And if any of you have ever seen or read any of his life story, you would know that. And I put in a plug for there's a movie that was made of his life with the man who plays the role of the Pope is Ed Asner. Now, Ed Asner is known as a comedian, but he actually does a terrific job in this movie about the Pope. It's a little bit long, but it's worthwhile because it really gives an appreciation. But he was a man who was from simple background. He was a farmer. He comes from a farming family. And I found a quote, if I can find it, which was kind of an interesting thing. He said, Italians come to ruin most generally in three ways: women, gambling, and farming. He says, my family chose the slowest one. He was a very ordinary man, simple person, but simplicity does not mean stupidity. He was an historian. He has a doctorate in theology. He had a formation in canon law. He was noted for being a tremendous organizer. That's how he ended up in Rome, so that he could reorganize the Society for the Propagation of the Faith. That still exists today. We have a collection for them once a year. He was in the diplomatic corps, and he learned a great deal about human relations and about politics while he was in the diplomatic corps, and he was in the diplomatic corps in very unusual places. He was in Bulgaria. That puts him in touch with the Eastern Bloc, puts him in touch with the politics that come from that end of the world in 1925, 1935. He was also in Turkey and in Greece, which would explain why he was so interested in the Orthodox Church and why he was so keen on working for and promoting Christian unity. So he brought all of this with him when he was elected Pope in 1958. No one thought that by 1959 he would convoke an ecumenical council. Now, an ecumenical council is a big deal. In our 2,000 years of history, Vatican II was the 21st ecumenical council. There are only been 20 others before in 2,000 years. So this 76, now 77-year-old guy calls his cardinals together and he says, you know, I had this reflection and I think I'm going to have a council, an ecumenical council. Well, then they thought for sure he had gone crazy. But that's what he did. And they set up the preparatory commissions and they started to work on getting this thing to happen. It was not easy. Now, why did he do that? Why was Vatican II necessary? Well, just to quote some of his own words from the opening speech that he gave in 1962. Most of us have probably not heard these words. And he says this, and I'll quote it. Making our own Jesus' recommendation that we learn to discern the signs of the times, that's a scripture reference from the Gospel of Matthew. It seems to us that we can make out in the midst of so much darkness, more than a few indications that enable us to have hope for the fate of the church and of humanity. So he's talking about darkness. He says, in spite of that darkness, we can see something. There are some indications that can speak to us of hope for the fate of the church and of humanity. And then he describes a few things. And he says, the successive bloody wars of our times, the spiritual ruins caused by many ideologies, and the fruits of so many bitter experiences have not been without useful lessons. Scientific progress itself, which has given man the ability to create catastrophic implements for his own destruction, has raised anxious expectations. It has forced human beings to become thoughtful, more aware of their own limitations, desirous of peace, alert to the importance of spiritual values. And there's more, but I'm going to stop there. Now, what's he talking about? Successive bloody wars of our times. This is 1959. Just finished World War II. Maybe the Korean War is just over. In the aftermath of the world trying to reconstruct itself after the war. Then he refers to man's scientific progress and the fact that we've created now the capacity to annihilate ourselves. Do you remember the Cuban Missile Crisis? That's what he's talking about. That's what he's talking about. And he's talking about the desire for peace. Now, Pope John the 23rd wrote an encyclical, his first encyclical. He only wrote two. Pacem in Terris, which means peace on earth, and Mater et Magistra, mother and teacher. The first one, Peace on Earth, was a proposal intended for the whole world to receive as a possibility for bringing about peace. What's interesting is to know that that document became a working document for the United Nations. They actually studied it, and they referred to it because it proposed a way forward in the midst of all of this darkness and scientific fear that was the context of the 60s. So, the reason why Vatican II was necessary was because the world had changed and the church needed to catch up. Now, those of you who remember the heyday of Vatican II, there was a word that was a key word. It was an Italian word. Everyone who was into Vatican II knew this word. And that word was aggiornamento. Aggiornamento. What it means is, literally, it's bringing yourself up to date. To bring yourself to the day that we are in. Aggiorno, to come to the day. And so the purpose of Vatican II for Pope John the 23rd was to try to bring the church to where the world had moved to. The modern world was the expression. In 1959, though, what did the modern world look like? Well, parts of it looked like what I've just described. And remember those early days of the 60s, some of the other things that were going on. That was the modern world, but it wasn't the modern world that the bishops had come together to reflect on and to talk about. The expression meant, as I look back on it now, moving the church from the Council of Trent into maybe the 19th century, never mind the 20th. It's to move it somewhat forward, but they weren't quite ready to go to the 20th, and they certainly weren't ready to go into the 21st. That would need some other people to do that. But what about the church in 1959? What did it feel like? What did it look like? Most people who can recall those days would say that to be Catholic in those days was very clear. You knew what you had to do. You knew the catechism, you went to church, you did your Easter duty, you followed the 6 precepts of the church, you knew the commandments, and you for sure had memorized all of the questions and all of the answers of the Baltimore Catechism. Does that sound, Things were clear. And clear usually meant that that was going to be the way it was going to be forever. It was the unchanging and unchangeable church. There was a Latin expression that described that church. And that Latin expression is Ecclesia semper idem, which means the church always the same. Maybe that's what most Catholics thought. But was it really that way? Because doubts were beginning to creep in. And where were the doubts coming from? Well, in the 50s, you had a whole lot of people who were trying to get their lives together after having been through maybe 1, maybe 2, maybe 2.5 wars. And the old song says, how are you going to keep them down on the farm after they've been to Paris? Well, that's because it's a way of saying that when you've been exposed to this, you can't just be indifferent to the impact of war. People had been through economic depressions. Those who had been to Europe in the war may have actually encountered atrocities of all kinds, things that we're still trying to come to terms with. And the politics. In Italy, there was an arrogant fascism that had marked that country. In Germany, there was a pagan national socialism. In Russia, there was an atheistic communism. And somebody once told me, he says, you know what happens when you take God out of Catholicism? What happens? If you take God out of Catholicism, you end up with fascism. If you take God out of communism, or out of democracy, sorry, take God out of democracy, you end up with communism. And when you take God out of the socialism that reigned in Germany, you end up with a return to paganism. God was slowly being pushed out of the picture. So all of this to say that the world in the 50s was in the process of trying to build itself up, trying to overcome what had happened during the war, and people were still living with the consequences of that war and wondering what the future would hold. Now, on a personal note, I'm standing up here talking to you this evening, and there's a sense in which the reason why I'm here is because of the World War II. I wouldn't be here tonight if the Battle of Monte Cassino had not happened. Have any of you heard of the Battle of Monte Cassino? A couple of people. The Battle of Monte Cassino was the biggest battle of World War II in Europe. Monte Cassino is where the monastery of Saint Benedict, the first monastery in Europe, was built on top of the mountain. Well, I was born in a village right at the bottom of that mountain. And when the Battle of Monte Cassino occurred, they bombed this place because the Allies couldn't come up the only road because they were stopped by this mountain. So they blew it up. Now, I read somewhere, statistically, I don't know enough about military stuff to know how to do this, but it seems that when you put together all the bombs that were dropped on that mountain, the collective firepower there was more than the TNT value of the bomb, the atomic bomb, dropped in Hiroshima. So there was nothing left in that whole valley. So my parents and I decided to come here. Not really. My parents came to this country because they were looking to find another future. So, a personal note. And in all of this, what was the church's role? When you start to think, and some people did think, how could Catholics allow all of this destruction to happen? And they were Catholics on both sides. They had chaplains on one side and chaplains on the other side, and they were both praying to the same God so that the other side would lose. I guess God was caught in a dilemma. How could we let that happen? Now, that was going on in Europe, but during 1940s, 42, 43, 44, what was going on among young people in North America? Well, I've been reading recently some stuff written from those days. Have any of you ever heard of the Baroness Catherine Dorothy from Madonna House? She wrote a book, a little book, it's called Dear Bishop. And it's a series of 10 letters that she writes to a bishop, and she's telling the bishop what she is observing as she worked as a barmaid in New York during 1942, 43, 44. And she relates to the bishop what she feels the bishop was not hearing because he just wasn't there. And she is telling him how the workers, the young people, the soldiers who were coming into the bar where she worked were disappointed with society, and they were looking for a solution, and they were wondering what would happen to them. And they were looking to every possibility, including communism, because that was the big threat, right? But no one ever gave a second thought to the church or to the gospel or to the teachings of the Lord. So that was going on right here in North America. And back then, already, young people were turning away. That's what gave rise to, remember things like Catholic Worker Movement, CYO, Catholic Youth Organization, Young Christian Students, YCS. These were all attempts to try to get the word of the gospel to young people who were already turning away from the church already prior to the 50s. And then after the war, there was a great effort at reconstructing the world. Now, there was that great reconstruction, involved money, it involved great effort, it involved lots of people engaged in these various projects. Question was, what was the underlying philosophy for that reconstruction? What was the vision that was supporting the rebuilding of Europe and the world that had just been devastated? Well, we know of at least two visions that ended up in another confrontation. One philosophy was communism or socialism. The other one was capitalism. And behind those two things, there was the conflict or the ideological conflict between democracy and communism. Where was the gospel? Oh, in some circles, the gospel was being presented. Catholic Action was one of those. Catholic Action, if any of you remember it, was summarized in 3 words: observe, judge, act. So young Christian workers or young students, or you'd get together and you would take a look at your world around you, you would observe. Then you'd come together and you would try to come up with an assessment and analysis, and you would make a judgment. And then the point was, now make a decision and move. Go to and act. Observe, judge, act. Communism was thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. The Catholic Action movement, which was trying to counter the communist movement in Europe. That's where it started, in France and Belgium and those areas. So all of this was going on, but the power of the gospel was not on the minds of the majority. And it's in this context that John the 23rd arrives on the scene with his background in history and theology, with his experience of diplomacy, and his first-hand experience of war and its effects. And he did the unimaginable in the church of that day. He pointed to the elephant in the room. And what that means is that John the 23rd let his heart express what he felt. And he let his mind affect his ministry. Now, I found myself thinking about why Angelo Giuseppe Roncalli called himself John. And my conclusion was that I think he saw himself and the church called to prepare the way of the Lord. So one reason is, I think, because he saw in the name of John, John the Evangelist, something of the mission that he had been entrusted with and that he should lead the church along to do. And the other John that is significant, of course, is John the Evangelist. And my sense is that for Angelo, John the Evangelist was the one who presented God as love. And in a context of post-war, in a context of Cuban Missile Crisis, in a context of kind of hatred, the way to peace, the only way to peace, was through the experience of love. Now, there may be another reason he also gave himself the name John, and particularly John the 23rd. In the 16th century, there was another guy that called himself John the 23rd, and he was an anti-pope. 9 or 10 Italian cardinals got together and chose this guy and made him a pope. But there was another one in France, and there was another one in Spain. You know, communications were not quite what they are today. And so there were 2 or 3 guys running around calling themselves pope. One of them called himself John, and he was the 23rd one, but he was an anti-pope. And no one ever wanted to use that name again, because what would he be? Would he be John the 23rd, or would he be John the 24th? Well, Angelo cleared up the mess, and he says, I'm taking the name. I'm going to be John the 23rd, and the other guy is John the 23rd wannabe. But there's an image here that I think is important to understand Vatican II, because it's about bringing the church to speak about herself. In the Gospel of John, in chapter 1, in verse 22, John the Baptist has been preaching, and he's been saying, calling people to repentance and all that sort of thing. And those who are hearing him, like, they're not sure what's going on. They're not sure what to make of this guy. And so they send a delegation, and they ask him questions. Now, in Latin, the question is, quid dices de te ipso? And in English, that simply means, what do you say about yourself? Now, that question, which was asked of John, is the question that John put to the church. And so when the council came together, the purpose of the council, among other things, was to speak and to answer the question, what do you have to say about yourself? What do we as a church have to say about ourselves? And do we have anything to say to this world that we live in? John the 23rd was convinced that the church and the gospel had a place and a role to play in the reconstruction of the world. And that's why one of the talks that's going to come along, I don't know at which point in the series, but it's going to be on the document that speaks about the church, and the title of that document is Lumen Gentium, the light of the world. John the 23rd believed that the church has a role to play. And that role was the same, and is the same role that John the Baptist played. And that role was to say, you see that guy over there? That's the Messiah. He's the light of the world. That's our job as the church. To be the mirror. To be the ones who reflect the light of the world. We are not the light of the world. Just as John the Baptist said, he was not the Messiah. The church is not the light of the world. So when you hear that document presented, keep that in mind. Those opening words, which give the name to the document, are not about the church. They're about Jesus Christ. And the role of the church is to highlight and to point out and to direct people's minds and hearts and attention to Jesus Christ, who is the light of the world. When I was putting this together, I found myself looking at, in my mind, I went to the theater some years back in England. I went to see Jesus Christ Superstar. And it's still a great show. But there's a line in the play where Jesus is brought to Herod. And Herod very arrogantly says to Jesus, "Prove to me that you're no fool. Walk across my swimming pool." Any of you remember the words enough to recognize that? Yeah? Prove to me that you're no fool. Walk across the swimming pool. He needed someone to demonstrate the credibility of Jesus. The church, we are there to point out who Jesus is, to let others know who he is. And so the bishops of the church came together at the Second Vatican Council to do just this. They responded to the vision of an old man named John, who felt that the church had to catch up to where the people were. Not because the people were in a good place, but because wherever they were, they needed a message. So when we talk about the church in the modern world, we're not saying that we got to get to the church in the modern world because that's the best place to be. We got to go there because that's the place to be, because that's where the need is. But if we're over here, if we're back in the 16th century fighting ghosts, we're missing what's going on at this end. Unfortunately, this is the end, which is reality, which is now. Well, that same challenge is one of the challenges that we face today. But it was not an easy thing for Pope John XXIII to bring the bishops of the church of that time to see what he saw. In fact, in his opening speech, from which I just quoted at the beginning, near the end of it, he expresses his sadness at the fact that some bishops had boycotted the council. They had not gone there. And he was saddened by that. But he carried on. He carried on. And the Vatican Council, what was it? Well, I was looking for a way to describe it that we could all relate to. And what that 4-year experience was all about could be compared to an examination of conscience. An examination of conscience that the church needed to do. To examine where the church had been, to examine where the church was, to look at the church's practices and see what needed to be reviewed, what needed to be changed, so that the church's role as a messenger in the emerging culture would have a significant place. Vatican II didn't happen spontaneously. It took 4 years for it all to unfold, and it took a couple of years to prepare. I want to highlight two things about the preparation. One of them is that all the bishops of the world at the time were consulted, and they sent in, those who bothered, they sent in to their remarks. One of those guys, one of the bishops that was consulted, was 39 years old at the time. And that bishop was named Karl Wojtyla. He was 39 years old. He was a professor of philosophy. And the background of Pope John Paul II, Karl Wojtyla, is that he was a theologian, yes, but he was more than a theologian. He was a philosopher. And he was a philosopher schooled in something called phenomenology, which is a form of humanism. And in his studies and in his preoccupation for the church, one of the things that he was very concerned about was the relationship of faith and reason, faith and science, if you will, faith and culture. Now, all of those themes would become central to Pope John Paul II's writings later on, when he was Pope. But at the age of 39, he sent in his remarks, and his remarks were that the church had to address the wound at the heart of humanity. The wound at the heart of humanity. And what was that wound? It's a broken heart. The wound at the heart of humanity needed to be healed. And a broken heart can only be healed by love. And the one who is capable of doing that, the only one who is capable of doing that, is Jesus Christ, because he is the one who not only is the healer, but he is the model of what it means to be truly and fully human. Later on, when he would become Pope, these points would surface in almost every one of his encyclicals. And Pope John Paul II has filled a whole library of shelves with books and talks and conferences. But the same points keep coming back. Christ is the one who reveals to human beings what it means to be a human being. That was 39-year-old Karl Wojtyla. The other one, who was also a young theologian about the same age, was Father Joseph Ratzinger. And he was a professor as well. And he had written some material. He had been at the Second Vatican Council as an expert for his bishop. But he had shared his views on the meaning of Christianity. And we can see some of his themes recurring now in his pontificate. Well, they didn't know in 1957, 58, 59, that they would end up being the successors of Peter, and who, by the grace of God, were entrusted with the leadership of the whole church. And they've been doing that. John Paul II did it for 27 years. And Pope Benedict has been there for 7 or 8 years, and they're carrying on the ministry. Now, for those who remember those days, there were other names around too that were associated with Vatican II, also well-known theologians, also influential, and those names, some of them you might recall. One or two of them, one of them, the most well-known one probably, the most popular, maybe even more popular than Wojtyla and Ratzinger, Hans Kung. Right? Hans Kung. He wrote all kinds of good things. He also wrote all kinds of crazy things. Another one was Edward Schillebeck. He wrote on the sacraments, some very wonderful things on the sacraments. And then he went off the rails. There was another guy that I was personally very much affected by. His name was Charles Davis. Does anybody remember that name? Charles Davis. He was an English theologian, and he had been at the council, and he was very popular. And then the next thing I knew, I was a student, and I was following what he was writing, and he was writing these great things on the liturgy. And the next thing we heard in the news, he's just published a book called A Question of Conscience. And he declared that it was for him a question of conscience to leave the priesthood and to leave the ministry, and just disappeared from the scene, got married. I reconnected with him many, many years later when he came to teach in Montreal. He taught at McGill University. No, at Concordia University, I'm sorry. He taught at Concordia. And I was involved in his family and his children coming to be confirmed. But he had left, and he was compared to Martin Luther. His book, The Question of Conscience, was referred to as almost the same way as Martin Luther's nailing of the 95 theses on the door of the cathedral in Germany. There were others like that, and we don't need to go through all of this. But Vatican II went on, and a lot of these people contributed to Vatican II. What we now have, the heritage, the legacy of Vatican II is what we now have in the 16 documents that make up the substance of what was said, what was voted on, and what remains as the teaching of the Church. 16 documents. Just to make, by way of information, of the 16 documents, they're not all of equal value. That's not just, I'm not talking about the content, that some are better than others. They're not of equal importance. They're all important. But for instance, there are 4 documents that are constitutions. So a constitution is the highest level of document. That's the constitution on the liturgy, the constitution on the church, the constitution on divine revelation, and the pastoral constitution on the church in the modern world. Those are the 4 documents that you're going to be looking at in the series. So you're going to be looking at the constitutions, 4 of them. There are 9 documents that are called decrees. They're shorter, they're much more directive, and they deal with very specific points. For instance, there was a decree on social communication. There was the one on ecumenism that a lot of people are more familiar with. There's the one that describes the pastoral office of the bishop. So that's where bishops' jobs were described for the first time in a long, long time in an actual document. Because prior to Vatican II, a bishop was only a priest who could do more work. Because if you remember the language, when you were consecrated a bishop, notice the words, when you were consecrated a bishop, you were consecrated with the fullness of the priesthood. Well, all that remains. But now we talk about the bishop as being ordained and consecrated. Because the bishop is one of three sacraments, three dimensions, 3 degrees of the sacrament of holy orders. That's why it's holy orders in the plural, because there's 3. Deacon, priest, bishop. But what's a bishop supposed to be about? Pastoral office of the bishop was defined, and so on. And then lastly, there were 3 declarations. 3 declarations. One of them on Christian education, one of them on the relationship with non-Christian religions, particularly with the Jewish people. That one became a very important one. Okay? And the last one was on religious liberty. It's an interesting thing, this one about religious liberty, because religious liberty wasn't just for Catholics. Religious liberty was meant for everyone. It's a right of individuals in any society to be able to have the freedom to express their convictions and their religious beliefs. So if we bring it right into our own times and we start to look at some of the things that are going on in governments today, one of the concerns that we have as bishops here in Canada is that some of the legislation and some of the things that our governments are doing are infringing upon our right to religious freedom. Well, all of these things are the things that happen there. So, what is it that Vatican II accomplished? How are we doing in time? Am I going on and on here? I've been at it for about an hour. Are you tired? A few more minutes? Okay. So, what did Vatican II accomplish? Well, perhaps we can all relate to the fact that whenever we start off with an intention, with a journey, with a dream, when reality kicks in, it doesn't always happen the way you had hoped. Well, I think the same thing can be said here of Vatican II. One of the first things, looking back on it after 50 years, is that life unfolds, but not always as you hoped or not as you imagined. Vatican II began with great expectations and with a lot of activity. But the dreams of the council did not all get realized. What happened? Well, the way I wrote it here in my notes is when Pope John XXIII opened the windows to allow the fresh air to come into the church, right? Opening the windows. The effect of opening the windows and catching up to the modern world was that many were converted to the allure and the attractions of the modern world and not the other way around. Opening the doors was supposed to let in the fresh air. But I guess if you open the doors, you can also look out and see stuff that maybe you didn't see before because the windows were all cloudy or hadn't been washed for a while or something. And what does that mean practically? I just share again a personal piece of my own story over these past 50 years. As I prepare for this, I realize how much I am a product and a child of Vatican II. Now, what does that mean? I went to college. I started college in 1962. That's the same time that the council started. And I graduated from college when Vatican II finished in 1964. Or 66, sorry. 1966. That's when I entered the seminary in Montreal. Now, when I entered the seminary in 1966, I walked into a world that hadn't changed since the 17th century. As soon as I walked in, the atmosphere was completely changed. The first Mass we had, I put on a cassock. And we were in a very well-structured, well-established formation program that the Sulpician Fathers had been working on and had mastered over the years, just like the Eudes Fathers here in Halifax. Saint Jean Eudes and Jean-Jacques Ollier were friends. They were from the same place, and they both created religious institutions for the purpose of training priests after the Council of Trent. So I walked into the 17th century. And then, first year over, go home for vacation, I get a letter in August of 1967. No preparation, just a letter. And it says, as of now, we will be moving to the campus of the University of Montreal, and we will join the fellow students at the university, and we are going to be trained there. Well, with that gesture, with that movement, the whole world turned upside down. We obviously couldn't go to the University of Montreal in our cassocks. So just visually we had to change. And we had to travel to class. That meant we couldn't have regular hours and regular routines for spiritual formation. Since we were moving to the university, we became victims of all university administrators, and you had one class over here and another class over there. One was at 7 in the morning, the other one was at 7 at night, and you didn't have much to do in between. And I remember the worst class that I was in, we were next to some kind of a biology lab, and all I could smell was the formaldehyde. That didn't help us to get a good handle on whatever the topic was that we were studying in theology. Anyway, all of this to show how things had changed. But here's another piece. When I walked into the seminary in 1966, I went in there with 110 students in first year. The seminary in Montreal could hold 500 students. In first year, 1966, 110 students. 4 years later, 11 of us were ordained. What happened to all the others? They had all gone over to the modern world. Which modern world? The modern world of secular, and in the context of Quebec, nationalistic Quebec society. And of the 11 who were ordained, there's only 6 of us left. What does that tell you in terms of the impact? Vatican II had an impact, but it didn't always have the impact that people had hoped for. So, here we are now. What has this all got to do with where we're trying to get to? Well, I go back to the quote from Pope John Paul II, who says that Vatican II, in spite of everything I just said, is the great grace bestowed on the Church in the 20th century. Pope Benedict, last October, when I was there for the opening of the Synod, on that night he also gave a talk, and he said the following, and I quote, "We have joy in our hearts, but I would say it is perhaps a more sober and humble joy. Over these 50 years, we have learned and experienced how original sin exists and is translated ever and anew into individual sins, which can also become structures of sin. We have seen how weeds were also always present in the field of the Lord. We have seen how Peter's net also brings in bad fish. We have seen how human fragility is also present in the church, how the ship of the church is also sailing against a counter wind and is threatened by storms. And at times, we have thought that the Lord is sleeping and has forgotten us. This is part of the experience of these last 50 years. But, and there's always a but, right? But we have also had a new experience of the Lord's presence, of His goodness and His power. The fire of the Holy Spirit, the fire of Christ, does not devour and destroy. It is a silent fire, a small flame of goodness and truth which transforms, giving light and heat. We have seen how the Lord does not forget us. Even today, in His humble way, the Lord is present and brings warmth to hearts. He shows us life. He creates charisms of goodness and charity which illuminate the world and give us a guarantee of God's goodness. Yes, Christ is alive and is with us today. And today, too, we can be happy because His goodness does not die. It remains strong even today. That was last October. And it was on the day that he inaugurated the Year of Faith, and that he inaugurated the Synod on the new evangelization for the transformation and the transmission of the faith. So, we are more sober and humble, but we carry on with the challenge that has been placed before us. You know, I've been talking about this new evangelization now for the last couple of years, but what I'm really talking about is what Vatican II established as the content and as the path for us to follow into the future. Not everyone bought it 50 years ago. Not everyone's going to buy it now. I'm very realistic. But the challenge remains real. I've said in another context that a lot of our baptized Catholics have not had the chance to experience what we're talking about. Why do I say that? Because the majority of our baptized Catholics have walked away. 77% of baptized Catholics in North America have turned away from the church. How can we possibly reach out and touch those hearts? That's the challenge that's before us. That was the challenge of Vatican II. They weren't ready to receive it 50 years ago in many parts of the world. Are we better now? Are we able to receive this now? Well, I'd like to make it really very concrete and bring it right close to us, right here at Halifax in Nova Scotia. we've been struggling with human fragility as well. And this human fragility is the aftermath of becoming aware of the sexual abuse crisis. And as we've been living through this, what I've seen is that the stuff that was presented at Vatican II could be received with the mind, but it wasn't received with the heart. And so it was not able to get beyond externals. Now we see why. And so now, hopefully, because more of us see the fragility, more are crying out for reform and renewal, for transparency, for accountability, and for responsibility. I've heard those words for the last 2.5, 3 years everywhere I've been. Now, if people are saying this, I'm hoping that they're saying it because it comes from a desire to make things right and to make things better. And so the archdiocese that we're in, we cannot ignore what's being asked for. And what's being asked for is our own aggiornamento and our own examination of conscience and our own coming to reconciliation. That takes time, that takes goodwill, but we have embarked on this journey of hope and renewal. So right now, what are we trying to do? We are struggling to figure out what it means to be a community of faith, where mutuality and relationships between and among brothers and sisters who make up the body of Christ can be experienced authentically and evangelically. We're trying to evolve in our understanding of ministry. We are trying to live with, hopefully, a new understanding of the exercise of authority. Many people think that they can call me up any day and that magically I can wave my magic wand and fix everything. That's a very unrealistic view of authority. I don't sit on top of the heap and tell people what to do. Authority is about listening and about hearing and about acting on what you've seen and heard with the best that you have. That kind of authority, that kind of obedience, because those two things go together, is an exercise in mutuality. So the concept that, the guy who's the boss can tell you to jump and you have to ask how high, that doesn't work anymore. Actually, it never worked any time. But we're trying to do that. And we're trying to look at how we can shape our communities and restructure them and give them the kind of support that are needed so that we can deal with reality as it is right now and not as it was in the 19th century. And I'm talking now about a legal issue, okay? I'm talking about the fact that this whole diocese is set up legally as a corporation sole, if any of you have ever heard that. The bishop owns everything. As I came in tonight, I parked somewhere and I saw that, no, I didn't park, Bob parked. And we saw that there's a sign there, and he says, oh, what the hell, I own the place anyway, so I can park where I want. Well, you see this idea that I own everything? That's not a good idea. That's not a good idea. And we're trying to work on that, see if we can come up with something better. Now, the foundations for all of this were laid out at Vatican II. And just the fact that I am able to say what I've just said. I don't have a lot of solutions, but I do acknowledge that we have problems. And just being able to acknowledge that we have problems makes a big difference. And because we're able to acknowledge that among the leadership of the church, and in the leadership of the church, there isn't just myself. The leadership of the church is made up of clerical and lay, baptized and ordained. And it's by developing a deeper appreciation for core responsibility that we're able to come up with the solutions that might be useful and effective in bringing the church to the world in which we're in. Hopefully we can do that. Well, I think I'm going to quit right here because I've done enough. Maybe just one last point. Have any of you ever heard of George Weigel? He's the guy that wrote almost the definitive biography of John Paul II. And he writes on different things, and he wrote in the National Review Online on October the 11th, 2012. He says, what we are experiencing is the end of the Counter-Reformation, and I'm quoting this now. Weigel calls what we are going through now the end of the Counter-Reformation and the emergence of evangelical Catholicism. Now, for many Catholics, those two words are incompatible, right? Those two words are incompatible, because whenever we hear the word evangelical, we think of the rock church or something, right? Or we think of, I don't know, Jerry Falwell, or we think of one of those characters. That's not, of course, what's meant here. What's meant here is a Catholicism that is rooted in the gospel, a Catholicism that is rooted in the person of Jesus Christ and in the Word of God. And so he goes on to say about the emergence of an evangelical Catholicism, which is a culture-forming counterculture that offers the world friendship with the Lord Jesus Christ as the fulfillment of the deepest aspirations of the human heart. The new evangelization is about this. And the new evangelization is to try to take what was proposed at Vatican II in spirit and substance and bring it into our world and our church right now. Amen.